In the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals, as the title indicates, we have two concerns here. First is doing a metaphysic of morals, which, like a metaphysic of nature, is simply the application of a universal and necessary principle to a specific content-rich situation. So, for example, let's say that I know, and how I know this goes beyond the scope of this course, but let's just say that we accept that I know that every event has a cause, and I hear an explosion. I immediately experience that explosion as resulting from some cause or other, even if I do not yet know what that cause is. Because that's the way our reason is structured to experience the world, in terms of universal principles, appeal to which makes sense of our concrete individual perceptions. Okay? So I throw the chalk up in the air and it comes down, and I say that perception, what I just saw happen, can be explained in terms of the universal principle of gravitation. Okay? Now, when I explain events in space and time, specifically the behavior of objects, things in space and time, in terms of universal and necessary laws, like the laws of physics, I am doing the metaphysic of nature, or physics. However, just as there are universal and necessary principles which govern the behavior of things in space and time, such that we can describe the way the world is, there are also universal and necessary ethical principles which, when applied to particular moral situations, make it possible for me to judge what actions are permitted and which are prohibited. In which case, I am doing the metaphysic of freedom. In other words, ethics. Okay? Now, we saw in part 1 that the only thing Kant is willing to admit possesses absolute unconditional goodness is what? What is the only thing in the world that can be called absolutely good?
Goodwill.
The goodwill. And this tells us immediately that Kant's thinking is non-consequentialist, because my will may be good. I may will to help you, and yet, due to circumstances outside my control, my well-intentioned action ends up harming you. But we do not, on that basis, make the judgment that my will is bad. My will retains its goodness because it proceeded from the supreme principle of morality. It proceeds from duty, which is respect for the moral law, the categorical imperative. Okay? So the only thing good in and of itself, without further qualification, is the goodwill. The goodwill proceeds from duty. And to understand what it meant to proceed from duty as opposed merely to be in accordance with duty is that my action is taken for the sake of duty and not for the sake of some material incentive which I may have. If I tell you the truth, but only because I am afraid of the consequence of being caught in a lie, even though I've done the right thing, I've not done it for the right reason. And so my will cannot be called good under that circumstance. Okay? However, if I tell you the truth, and especially if I tell you the truth when I have an inclination to tell you a lie, but tell you the truth simply because I recognize that I have a moral duty to do so, then indeed my will retains moral goodness. Okay? So we drew a distinction, which is very important, between action from reason versus action from inclination. When my will is determined by reason, which means when what I do proceeds from my recognition of a universal and necessary moral obligation to do so, then my will is good. But even if I do exactly what duty prescribes, tell you the truth, okay? But I am doing so simply to avoid getting in trouble, then my will does not possess moral goodness, okay? Because it is being determined by inclination. I have an inclination, let's say, toward having a good reputation, or I have an inclination toward being powerful, or the accumulation of wealth, all these things which Socrates told us were false goods. Okay? So when it comes to making a moral judgment about the content of a will, whether the will can be called good or bad, the focus is on the maxim, the subjective principle of volition. If my maxim is grounded in reason, which is the author of the categorical imperative, then the will is good. But if my maxim is a personal inclination, even if that inclination is consistent with duty, then the will cannot be called good. At best, it can be called neutral, okay? Now,
I don't really understand that.
okay, look. You and I can do the exact same thing, okay? I tell you the truth, you tell me the truth. Fine? But you are telling me the truth because you recognize it's the right thing to do. And the reason you recognize it's the right thing to do on a Kantian basis is because you have gone through the process of attempting to universalize your maxim. And you realize that if everybody lied all the time, it would be impossible to lie. And so you couldn't get away with your own lie. So the maxim contradicts itself at the universal level. Okay? I, on the other hand, am doing exactly the same thing that you are doing in terms of action. I'm telling you the truth. But let's say that I am telling you the truth, not because I recognize the universal necessary obligation to do so, but simply because I am inclined to avoid getting into trouble. Then my will does not have moral content or goodness. Okay? Fine. So as we moved into part 2, we discovered the first formulation of the categorical imperative, which simply states something to this effect. Act only on that maxim which you can at the same time will to be a universal law. So what if everybody told lies with the same regularity that whatever goes up comes down? Then nobody would believe anybody and lying would become absolutely impossible. Okay? So notice the beauty of this theory is that its supreme principle, the categorical imperative, as categorical, does not contain any content. I know in advance of any situation within which I may find myself exactly what morality will require of me. It will require the possibility of universalizing my maxim. Okay? All right. So as we moved into part 2, the question became, where does the categorical imperative come from? How do I know that it's something real? Okay? We drew a distinction between 2 types of imperatives. Okay? Remember that imperatives are commands. Do this. Do not do that. Okay? And imperatives, or commands, can either be hypothetical or, in the case of moral imperatives, categorical. Just because I tell you that hypothetically speaking, if you want a good baseball glove, buy a Wilson. If you don't already have an interest in buying a good baseball glove, then my hypothetical advice to you doesn't apply. Okay? There's no reason for you to go buy a Wilson A2000 if you don't care about playing baseball. Okay? But when it comes to moral imperatives, which must be universal and necessarily binding, they must arrive from categorical principles. Okay? So there is no if-then structure to moral imperatives. I'm not saying if you want a good reputation, then you ought to treat all customers fairly. Or if you want to avoid trouble, then you ought always to pay back your debts or to tell the truth. No, I am saying you must tell the truth. You must pay your debts. You must not make false promises. The question is why? Why not? And in part 2, he tells us why not. If there is to be a supreme principle of morality, meaning that it is an imperative that is categorical, applying with absolute universality and necessity to all rational beings, then it cannot arise from anything hypothetical. It must arise from something which applies to all rational beings as such. Okay? If morality was based in feelings, as the utilitarians maintain, like Hume, because we all have different feelings, this opens the door to ethical relativism. Okay? But for Kant, the idea that ethics could be relative is tantamount to saying there is no such thing as ethics in the first place. Okay? So the supreme principle must be supreme. It must have universal necessary authority. So the question is, where does it come from? What's its origin? If the categorical imperative is categorical, which means it applies to all of us all the time, no matter what. If its authority is absolute, then whatever grounds that authority must itself possess absolute worth. Let me run this by you again. If I issue a hypothetical imperative, if you don't want to get wet after class, then you ought to carry an umbrella. But if you don't care about getting wet, and in fact enjoy going walking in the rain, then the consequent of my if-then statement, in other words, then carry an umbrella, doesn't apply to you, okay? But when it comes to ethics, imperatives must apply with absolute necessity to all of us. And so it must be grounded in something which itself has absolute worth. And so at this point, we draw a distinction between what we might call the value of things versus the worth of persons. And by persons, Kant means rational beings. Okay? And by rational beings, again, Kant essentially means beings that are capable of formulating universal principles. Okay? Sure, my dog might realize that if it's hungry and barks, then I'm going to feed it. But this is simply a matter of Pavlovian conditioning. Okay? The dog does not sit back and formulate a principle that, barking is a tactic for achieving an end. Okay? Well, things, whether the desk, the computer, even my own body is a thing. Okay? Things have only relative value. Okay? If I don't need to sit in class and take notes, then this desk has no value to me unless I were to sell it to somebody who does have that need. Okay? And such is the case with all things. Things have what Kant calls a market value. Okay? And you are all somewhat familiar, of course, with simple supply-demand economics. The more a thing is in demand, the higher the price for that thing is. When something is no longer in demand, then it goes on sale. Okay? So the value of things is relative. And whether I desire it is a matter of hypothetical situations. Okay? So if imperatives of morality are to be categorical, they cannot be grounded in things. Okay? Persons, on the other hand, do not have a market value. Persons have what Kant calls an absolute worth. Okay? Does anybody know the word he uses for that absolute worth? It is unconditional, but he calls it dignity. Okay? So for Kant, dignity is not something which you can either succeed or fail at possessing. As a rational being, which means a being capable not only of formulating, but also acting on the basis of a principle rather than just an inclination, then you possess a dignity. And dignity is the worth of a rational being. It is inviolable. In other words, if the chair breaks, I may decide to throw it out. Okay? But if you break, let's say you have some kind of mental breakdown, I can't just throw you away because your value isn't value at all. It is a worth. We are the ones that ascribe value to everything else. Okay? So the worth of a rational being is absolutely inviolable, which basically means this. It doesn't matter if I know you. It doesn't matter if I like you. Whether you're my enemy or my friend. It doesn't matter whether I have something to gain from you. I still must respect you as a rational being, which means a being capable of directing his or her own behavior. Okay? The rock is not self-directed. You throw the rock up, the rock is completely subject to the law of gravitation. Something outside the rock determines its behavior. But when it comes to a rational being, my decision to do something is free. It is self-determined. And it is that ability for us to determine our own behavior rather than allowing our behavior to be determined by something other than our own rationality. Either by what someone else wants me to do, or by my inclination toward power, or reputation, or wealth. Okay? My ability to determine my own behavior on the basis of rational principles as opposed to inclinations is the basis for my having dignity. Okay? A dog may choose not to eat, maybe because it doesn't feel well or not hungry. But a dog does not choose not to eat on principle. It does not go on hunger strikes. Okay? So the worth of a rational being, what Kant calls a dignity, is an inviolable worth. It doesn't matter what you do. Even if you are the most repugnant person on earth, you are still a free being and therefore retain the dignity of that freedom. And indeed, that is the basis upon which punishment is justified. If you were only a thing or an animal and didn't have the power of self-determination, of determining your own action, but could only act according to instinct, or for Kant, inclination, which is basically equivalent to instinct, then I would be no different than a thing. My behavior would be the result of forces outside my control. Okay? So Kant hits us with the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which was treat all rational beings as ends in themselves, never only as a means. And of course, that does not suggest that we don't enter into agreements with one another. We certainly do. Okay? When I check out my groceries at Walmart, okay, I am not treating the checker as a means only because it is understood that he is there of his own free will, is being compensated for being there, and so the very same action, his or her checking out my groceries, serves the end of both of us. It respects me as an end, and it respects you as an end. Okay? Now we've said that if there is to be an imperative of morality that is categorical, namely universal and necessary in scope, then it must be grounded in something which itself possesses absolute worth. And that is nothing other than rational being itself. Because human beings have an absolute worth called dignity, it is possible for there to be a categorical imperative which has absolute authority over all such rational beings.
Give an example. Categorical.
Well, the categorical imperative, remember, is one single principle, although I can articulate it in three different forms. Okay? The form of universality states to act only on that maxim which you can will as a universal law. Okay? And what that basically reveals to me is some aspect of the golden rule. Okay? If I couldn't possibly imagine a world in which everyone did exactly the same thing that I am about to do, then my rationality tells me that I shouldn't do it. And if I cop out and say, sure, not everybody's going to do this, so I'm just going to make an exception for myself, you're being untrue to yourself. And you know it. You're false. You're false as hell. And so it doesn't matter, how you talk yourself into it. The second formulation, that's fine, we'll confirm. The second formulation tells me that I must treat rational beings, you and me, as ends in themselves, never only as a means, which means that your value has nothing to do with what you do. Okay? You don't earn it. You are it. Because as a rational being, you are free. And it is freedom, the ability to act on the basis of a principle rather than simply on the basis of an inclination, that gives you worth. Okay? If I was not a rational being, if every time I had an inclination to do something, like to eat a gallon of ice cream, or to steal a bicycle, or to call someone a name, if I did everything I felt like doing, then I would be allowing my behavior to be determined by factors other than my own rationality. And therefore, like a thing, I'd be behaving more like a thing or animal than like a person. Okay? So because human existence, rational beings, are ends in themselves on the basis of their capability of self-determination. They must be respected as ends and never only as a means. And what this suggests is very simple. Do not use people. And if I tell you a lie, I'm using you. Because I am not giving you all of the relevant information to make a free decision for yourself in the interest of the categorical imperative. Okay? Treat all rational beings as ends in themselves, never only as a means. Okay? And what this formulation of the categorical imperative really focuses on is the origin of the imperative. What is the origin of ethics, of the categorical imperative? The only reason there is a categorical imperative, that is a command which is absolutely binding, is because it arises from the existence of some being which itself has absolute worth, namely, you and me. Okay? We are the categorical imperative. Which, of course, is why Kant argues that we don't need to have any foreign incentive to do the right thing. Because we know that the right thing has authority over us because we discover it ourselves. We ourselves author the moral law. Or better yet, we simply are the moral law. Okay? And finally, of course, after our brief discussion of the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties to self and others, okay, we finally saw the third formulation of the categorical imperative, or the formulation of the kingdom of ends, okay? But of course, before I talk about that, maybe I can just take a very brief moment and remind you that the difference between a perfect duty and an imperfect duty does not mean that imperfect duties aren't real duties. They are. All it means is that it is possible for a perfect duty to conflict with an imperfect one. And in that case, the perfect duty takes precedence. Okay? So if I have a perfect duty to tell the truth and an imperfect duty to, let's say, give to charity, okay, then I cannot tell you a lie in order to be charitable. If you ask me directly if I have $5 to borrow, now I don't necessarily have an obligation to lend it to you depending on the situation, okay? But let's say that my reason for not wanting to lend the money is that I already wanted to give it to charity. I am not entitled to tell you a lie. I have to be straightforward. I have to say, yeah, actually I do have $5, but I'm sorry. I've already got plans for it. Now, if you were to remind me, but wait a minute, Michael, you owe me $5. Now I have a pre-existing perfect duty, which must be satisfied. In fact, Kant would have to say something like, if you are already subject to a perfect duty, like telling the truth, then you cannot enter into any subsequent obligation which will create yet another perfect duty which conflicts with the original. Okay? All right. The third formulation talks about kingdoms. And we saw that by a kingdom, what Kant means is a systematic unity of beings governed by common laws. Okay? So we could talk about the kingdom of nature. Okay? The animal kingdom. It is governed by the law of the survival of the fittest. Okay? We could talk about the laws of nature, which govern the behavior of objects in space and time. And because all objects in space and time necessarily follow space-time laws, there is a harmoniousness between them. Okay? But of course, that is a kingdom of nature. And all causality in nature is what Kant would call heteronymous. Heteronomy means being directed by something outside oneself or something other. That's what hetero means. Other, as in heterosexual, the other sex. Okay? The kingdom of nature is a system of heteronymous causality because every member of that system is determined in its behavior by something other than itself. A rock will stay still until something else imposes a force upon it. Okay? We, on the other hand, belong to a kingdom of ends, which means that we are all members of a kingdom in which every member is king. Okay? And so I should treat all rational beings, including the rational being that I myself am, as a law-giving member of a kingdom of ends, which in my interpretation basically means that when you're deciding what to do, you must remember that you are, in your action, legislating. You are making law. You are suggesting that this is what a human being ought to do. And if I legislate or behave in a way that suggests a principle which violates your absolute worth as a king in this system, then I have done something immoral. In other words, my freedom ends where your freedom begins. Okay? Just as if we had a closed system of objects. Okay? Let's say we had a mouse trap. Okay? And every part depended upon the other parts so that it all functioned smoothly in order to go through its process and drop the cage over the mouse. Okay? If one of those pieces failed to function according to the rules, then the whole thing breaks down. Likewise, in the kingdom of ends to which we belong, if one of us acts contrary to the law of morality, then I have introduced chaos into the system and therefore disharmony. Okay? What the third formulation really emphasizes is that to be moral is to engender a harmonious coexistence in a kingdom of rational beings. Okay? Come. All right. So we've discussed all of this already. Okay? But what we haven't discussed is the third part. And the third part really deals with what we might call a perennial problem in philosophy. Meaning what? What is a perennial?
Through the years.
Yeah, something like that, right? We call flowers perennials, ones that bloom every year, right? Or something like that. I'm not a botanist. But we call some problems, like the problem of the existence of God, or the problem of the origin of the universe, perennial issues in philosophy because they recur again and again, okay? And one such problem is what we call the problem of evil. In fact, hold on a second. That's all right. Let's deal with this instead. One such perennial problem is the problem often called freedom versus determinism. Okay? Have you ever heard this issue? All right. Consider this. We are hopefully all willing to agree that every event has a cause. Okay? Newton establishes this as a universal necessary law. Which means there cannot be an event that doesn't have a cause. We call that the principle of sufficient reason. For anything that exists or any positive fact, there must be an explanation. Okay? And if it is true that every event has a cause, and my actions are events, which they certainly are, what would follow? If every event has a cause, and my action is an event, what must my action also be? The effect of a cause. That's right. If every event has a cause, and I throw the chalk into the air, and that's an event, this would suggest that my throwing the chalk into the air was caused by some other event. And in nature, or the system of heteronomy, where everything that happens is determined by some foreign or alien cause, if my decision to throw the chalk into the air follows the principle that every event has a cause, this would suggest that I'm not really free. If every event has a cause, and I can express the rules which govern the relationships between causes and effects, then perhaps I could even calculate exactly what you are likely to do by looking at your childhood, your history, your mood. If I had all the information, then perhaps I could make a pretty good guess about how you are going to handle a situation. Okay? However, we seem to insist on the doctrine that human beings are free. After all, we hold people responsible. We punish people. We incarcerate people. We reward people when we judge it to be fitting. Okay? So the problem is, how can freedom exist in a deterministic universe? how can I say every event has a cause, and yet my personal actions are not caused by other events? And surprisingly, perhaps, Kant's answer is, I can't. I cannot prove that I am actually free. Because freedom, like God, like the soul, are what he calls transcendental ideas. They lie outside of the realm of human understanding. Okay? Now, think through this logic. Kant has said from the beginning that if there is to be such a thing as ethics, then the imperatives of morality must be categorical. If there is to be a categorical imperative, it must be grounded in something which has absolute worth. And the only thing which has absolute worth is rational being, and that is because to be rational means to be free. Thus, the existence of the categorical imperative is grounded in the existence of freedom. Okay? But if I cannot prove that freedom actually exists, then I cannot prove that there is actually a categorical imperative. How does Kant deal with this difficulty? Well, here's basically what he says. Even though I cannot give you a demonstration, and by that I mean a rational demonstration, an argument, to show that we are actually free. From the practical point of view, I always face decisions. I find myself from moment to moment having to choose, to go left, to go right, to do, not to do. Practically speaking, we find ourselves having to make choices. And so whether or not I can metaphysically prove the existence of freedom as a real thing, from a practical point of view, I have no choice but to proceed in my life as if I were actually free. Because what am I going to do? Okay? When 12:15 rolls around, it dawns on me that I cannot prove that I am actually free to get up and leave this room, so I simply sit here for the rest of my life. That is the same thing as deciding not to get up. Okay? So for a being who must proceed on the assumption that he or she is actually free, from a practical point of view, that person really is free. And so the problem of freedom versus determinism, although perhaps insurmountable at the metaphysical level, at the practical ethical level, is not a problem at all. Because I can only understand myself as a being with choices that must make decisions, and that those decisions are often between acting on the basis of the categorical imperative or acting on the basis of my inclinations, then I really am subject to the categorical imperative, and therefore to judgments regarding the goodness or lack thereof of my will. Okay? Now, if my will, which of course is what Kant calls the kind of causality belonging to a free being, as opposed to the kind of causality belonging to nature, which is heteronomy. Okay? if I allow my behavior to be determined not by my respect for the moral law, but by my feelings, if I do exactly what I feel like doing or what my emotions are compelling me to do, then I'm acting more like a thing or an animal than like a person, because things and animals allow their behavior, or their behavior is necessarily determined by factors outside of themselves. What gives us a dignity is that we ourselves are the rational cause of action in ourselves. Okay? So even think back to like Aristotle and virtue, like the virtue of temperance. If I would like to eat this entire birthday cake, but I do not recognize that the virtue of temperance will ultimately lead to more happiness than indulging in the entire cake and thereby getting ill and having everybody mad at me because they didn't get any and all the rest of it, okay? And I do so anyway, I am just like a thing. I'm being kicked around by factors that are alien to me and not my own rational decision making. Okay? So this is a doctrine about freedom, about taking your freedom seriously and realizing that it is only because we are free, that is, capable of acting according to maxims that are universalizable and of our own authorship, that I have a dignity that separates me from any other kind of thing, including animals. Okay? And so, because I must live my life on the assumption that freedom is real, I actually make decisions. I cannot fail to have to make decisions. From a practical point of view, I am truly free. And thus, from a practical point of view, the categorical imperative has real authority over me. Okay? Okay. And that basically covers it. Okay? Now, of course, because Kant grounds his moral theory in the existence of autonomy, okay, and we haven't focused too much on this word, but autonomy means being self-directed. That's what auto means. Heteronomy means being directed by something other than oneself. Okay? Right? Auto means self. Hetero means other. If I allow my will to be determined by heteronomous causality, then I'm allowing my behavior to be determined by something other than myself. And I want you to think about this. You know how they say things like, the first time you rob a bank is the most difficult time, and every time after that it gets a little bit easier. The first person you kill is the hardest one, but after that it's a little bit easier. Okay? Well, this is just simply the structure of addiction, right? I mean, sure, nobody picks up their first cigarette saying, this is something good that I want to do, okay? As children, we might say, hey, this looks cool, or I want to be accepted by the crowd, or I'm curious about what it is. But before we know it, we're hooked. and we're no longer really even making the rational decision to smoke. It becomes part of us. And my inclination, which in this case is the simple physical urge to smoke, has gained power over me. So I become a slave to my inclinations, rather than retaining the power of self-determination, the only thing which sets me apart and gives me a dignity. That's why for Kant, that the more I allow my behavior to be determined by alien causes or heteronymous causality rather than autonomy or my own rational principle, little by little I chip away at my freedom. Now, think about addiction. Everyone in here, if not an addict yourself, has known somebody with addiction problems, okay? And in the final stages of addiction, there is a complete loss of control. Nobody, let's be honest, nobody wants to harm their family. Nobody wants to take the food off of their own children's table or not show up for a birthday party, to destroy their children's lives, to destroy their own lives, to have car crashes, to destroy your future. But these are the things that happen because every time I allow my behavior, every time I pick up that crack pipe, every time I indulge in this food that I know is killing me, it gets a little bit easier and a little bit easier because I stop thinking about it. And eventually, my behavior is being determined by forces completely alien to my own rationality. And so I am literally destroying myself. Okay? All right. So I'm sure that there are some more ideas we can talk about in Kant or clarifications, but for tonight you have your utilitarianism quiz. Over the next few days I'll post a Kant quiz. And finally, we are going to make our way into the last section of the course, which is existentialist ethics. Okay? All right.